Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Warner, and I'm president of the Culinary Historians of Chicago. And I think now we're in our 31st year. So because of people like you for always joining up with us, thank you. And we have a wonderful guest tonight. We have Sara Franklin, who there she is from White Plains, New York. She's in. Are you in White?
Kingston, New York.
Kingston, New York. I'm sorry, your cell phone thing said White Plains, but what do they know? So, Sara is a food writer and historian. She's received Sara Franklin, PhD. She's received a 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Grant for her research on Judith Jones, who she's going to talk about tonight in her book. Sara teaches courses on food and culture, writing, oral history at New York University's Gallatin School for Individualized Study, and via the New York University Prison Education Initiative. She's also the author of Edna Lewis. For those of you who might not know who Edna Lewis was, she was an icon in cooking, a renowned Black chef from the South. And anyway, and Sara holds a PhD in food studies from New York University and studied documentary, radio, and nonfiction at both the Duke Center for Documentary Studies and the Salt Institute for Documentary Studies. She also had developed quite a friendship with Judith Jones, the person who, shall we say, discovered Julia Child, helped launch her book. Judith Jones. Sara, I'm going to ask you to give a list of the people who Judith Jones edited.
Oh, goodness.
Pardon me?
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, or a partial list. It's immense. Judith Jones also was the one who discovered the Diary of Anne Frank and got it published.
In English.
In English. Oh, okay. And she was a pillar in American editing. So she was much more than just Julia Child's editor. Anyway, Sara, why don't you tell us about your relationship with Judith Jones, how you met her, and why you decided to do this book, The Late Judith Jones.
Certainly. First, thank you for having me and welcome everybody. I first met Judith Jones in January of 2013. I had been hired, there's quite a backstory here, but I had been hired to collect her oral histories for the Julia Child Foundation. I was a graduate student at the time. And when I caught wind that the foundation was starting or thinking of starting an oral history project with Judith after she retired from Knopf in 2011, she had been there for 57 years. I threw my hat in the ring thinking at best I'd be a research assistant. Maybe I'd get to shake her hand. She had quietly become a hero of mine, beginning with reading her memoir, The 10th Muse, My Life in Food, which she published in 2007. I had never heard of her before that, which I think for many people outside the cookbook community is true and remains true today. She's not a household name in the United States, and outside of publishing and outside of the cookbook world, very few people know who she is. That's, of course, begun to change a bit with fictional portrayals of her in movies like Julie and Julia, the HBO Max series Julia that's out now. But in January of 2013, I was sent to her apartment to meet with her because I was only allowed to have the reins of the oral history project on the condition that we got along well enough for her to want to work with me over a period of months. And I was terrified when I went to her door of her apartment in Manhattan. It was a very, very cold January day, but I was sweating through my clothing. I was really nervous. And she opened the door, and I don't know how many of you have seen a picture of her, had the pleasure of meeting Judith, but she was tiny. She was maybe 5'1" and very slim, and I didn't know how small she was. And so I was sort of taken aback when this tiny woman opened the door, and her little dog came running towards me and promptly ripped a hole in the sleeve of my sweater. And I sort of held my breath, what could be worse than adding this awkward moment on top of nerves. And Judith just erupted into laughter. She had this very deep, throaty laugh and completely disarmed me. And that was the beginning of me knowing that she was nothing like what I had been told she was like, which, you know, by the foundation was buttoned up, that she could be very reserved, quite chilly, difficult to get to know, that she was not, you know, she didn't like everybody. She didn't, in fact, like many people. That was not the experience I had of Judith at all. From the jump, that very first day when she invited me into her home and made me tea and then pulled oatmeal cookies out of her long ago linen closet that had been repurposed as a pantry back in the 1970s. We just sat on her living room couch and began to talk about life. We talked about travel and our ethics of travel. We talked about politics and what a mess American politics had become. We talked about leftovers and Americans' sort of peculiar resistance to using leftovers and the sort of showmanship of cookbooks that suggested that people put on a dinner party every night, and, you know, that you shop only for one meal at a time and cook only for one meal at a time. And she was exuberant. She was just full of life. She was incredibly curious. She was incredibly down to earth. And as a consummate editor, what she did to sort of put me at ease that day was she turned her questions on me. And she began sort of interviewing me about why I was interested in food and what had brought me to her and what I planned to do with my life. And I quickly realized that we were going to get along just fine. And we ended up working together for a period of several months over the spring and summer of 2013, first in her apartment in New York. And then we weren't done with our work when she left to spend the summer in northern Vermont, where she'd spent part of the year since she and her husband, the writer Evan Jones, had bought a little house on the side of a mountain in 1980. And so she invited me to come and spend time with her there, and which was an incredible compliment to me. It was her most sacred place, very intimate place. And we always began our time together by cooking. She insisted that she would not allow a tape recorder to run until we had cooked lunch together. And though Judith was the consummate queen of cookbooks, we never used a recipe. She would sort of pull bits and bobs out of the refrigerator. One day when I showed up in Vermont, she had a bowl sitting on the counter with a dish towel over the top, where she had started some bread dough early in the morning, but she told me she didn't have a plan for it, but she thought maybe pizza. And then we sort of riffed together. And my sense is Judith loved that. She loved her favorite part of the work of being an editor was the intimate collaboration with her authors, the sense of really rolling up her sleeves and getting down into a project, from its ethos to the language to its structure to testing the recipes. She knew it as intimately as the authors themselves, something that Mater Jaffrey said that has always stuck with me, and how incredibly rare. And after our work together was done, we remained friends. I didn't know if she would want to continue a relationship, but she invited me to lunch after we finished our time together. And so we would have lunch every couple of months. I would meet her mostly at her apartment. We would mostly cook. Sometimes we'd go out. She had me try to help her learn to do email. She was sort of famously fed up with computers and had never really learned how to use them. And we remained very close until she died in August of 2017. When she died, her stepdaughter, Bronwyn Dunn, who I had gotten to know a little bit over the course of knowing Judith, called and invited me up to the Friends and Family Memorial Service. There was a very big public service in New York City, but invited me up to the service in Vermont. And when the ceremony was over, she pulled me aside and she said, "I've just begun to go through the apartment in New York and I'm feeling quite overwhelmed. There's an awful lot of stuff. And might you like to come have a look at it with me and sort of help me figure out what to do with it?" I had 11-month-old twins at the time, and I had a book coming out. I was about to defend a dissertation. I had no business taking on a project, but I really had come to love Judith and knew that her legacy had been really under-celebrated. And so I said yes. And 2 months later, I was back in that apartment in Manhattan, and Bronwyn Dunn was opening a room to literally 2 rooms full of papers, letters dating back to the 1930s, marked up manuscripts, notebooks, diaries, photographs, all manner, a complete historian's dream, right? So not only did I have this rich personal relationship with her that I drew upon at great length in the book and these interviews that we had recorded together, which now live at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, but I was given access to this incredible wealth of personal material that gave me incredible insight into parts of Judith's life that she had never told me about and that I had never really known to ask about either. And so that was the beginning in earnest of starting work on the book that has become The Editor.
Um, before we talk about her relationship with Julia Child, I have my own personal memory. I'll share briefly about Judith Jones. Um, I would attend every year the Symposium for Professional Food Writers at the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. And one year Judith Jones was there. Julia Child would always be there. And that's a whole other story. I could talk about my interactions with that wonderful Julia Child. But Judith was there one year, and I went up to talk to her, and I thought this is going to be this patrician, elegant, maybe austere lady, and I just started chatting with her, and she was talking to me directly. I started to feel very comfortable talking to her, and I said to her, uh, it, she told me about her editing Julia Child's book, and the story about how she told her publisher, Alfred Knopf, he said, this will never sell. And she said it will. And he said, then I'll eat my hat. She told me the story how she said, and after the book became a success, I handed him his hat and said, eat it, or something like that. But I also asked her about editing Marcella Hazan's book. And many of you may know who Marcella Hazan was, but she was like the Julia Child of Italian cooking, but also a very difficult person. And I asked Judith how it was editing Marcella's books. And she said, oh, she was a horrible person. She said, she said, she was horrible. She said, I told her, I'm not going to work with you anymore. And I thought, wow, that's direct. I'm not gossiping here because this has been written about and printed. But I thought her directness, her honesty and sharing was so compelling. But anyway, that was my brief. And I walked with her to an event. I felt like she was my date. She was just so friendly. And anyway, that was my little brief interaction with her. But Sara, um, can you say, before we talk about her working with Julia Child, um, some of the people she edited, the major names, and if you can't list them all,
I can list many of them. Are we
oh yeah,
sticking to
many,
food?
there's
Are we
so
sticking
many.
to food here?
Food, well, some of the non-food people first, and then the food people.
Okay. Some of
Food
the
people
non-food
list
people first. So she is responsible for the publication of the Diary of Anne Frank in English. She was not given credit for her role in the publication of that book until decades after it became a runaway success for Doubleday, who published it in 1952 based on her recommendation, when she had been a secretary and living in Paris and France after the war. She was John Updike's editor for his entire career, except for his very first two books. She discovered the writer Ann Tyler and edited her for decades. Those two authors alone made Knopf millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. She was Sylvia Plath's American editor while Plath was still alive, so she's responsible for bringing her poetry to the United States. She edited John Hersey, William Maxwell, who was a fiction editor at The New Yorker for many, many years, Elizabeth Bowen, Peter Mayle, who some of you may know, My Year in Provence. This is his most famous book. That was at the end of her career. Many poets. That poetry and food were her two great sensual loves. So Frank O'Hara was another, and then Sharon Olds towards the end of her life, Pulitzer Prize winner. And several lesser known poets, well, John Ashbery, Langston Hughes, several not so lesser known poets as well. She was a tremendous force in poetry. But a fiction editor throughout her life. She also edited works of scholarship. She worked with Carolyn Hilbrun, who is one of the 20th century's best known feminist scholars and was one of the first women to get tenure at Columbia University, the first woman to achieve tenure in the English department. That was a book on androgyny, which tells you something interesting about Judith's politics and the kinds of things that she was interested in. But for her culinary list, I mean, it is the who's who of the food world. So beginning with Julia Child and Mastering the Art of French Cooking in 1961, we have Marcella Hazan, Claudia Roden, Mater Jaffrey, James Beard, MFK Fisher, Edna Lewis, Joan Nathan, the entire Knopf Cooks American series, which for those of us who love cookbooks was published primarily in the early 1990s, and as a series was really ahead of its time, publishing expressions of regional American vernacular cuisine. Some of the Joan Nathan, she first published Joan Nathan as part of that series, but also Ken Hom, Bruce Adels, Jean Volz, a number of really well-respected American food writers in that space as well. Marion Cunningham, Irene Kwa, Hiroko Shimbo, a very, very, very long list of cookbook authors.
It's a very long who's who list, isn't it, of cookbook authors? It's awesome. Now, you tell us more about your relationship. Well, no, tell us about the how, in a sense, she was, I guess, not treated very well. It's amazing to think of what an eminent, iconic figure she was, but at least for most of her career, she was like an underling at
Yeah.
Knopf, right?
Yeah.
She
Well,
wasn't
and
that
even
much.
before at Knopf. So she
Yes.
began at Doubleday when she was 17 years old, and she was a freshman at Bennington College in Vermont. That's when she got her foot in the door. Most of the editors were away at war, and Doubleday, which was the largest publishing house in the English-speaking world at the time, was desperate for editors to fill seats. She was sort of thrown into the ring with no training and handed manuscripts and told that they needed work. And that she said this lovely thing to me when she was recounting the story to me. She said, but no one told me what kind of work, so I just began going on instinct. No one ever trained Judith to become an editor. She taught herself based on her gut. And a lifetime of reading and really following singular voices. So from the beginning, she was quite invisible, both to her male colleagues, but also to her writers. And that suited her very well. She was not interested in being out front at the beginning. That began to change. So she came back to Doubleday after she had graduated from college in 1947. She stayed for about a year and a half. She became the handler of the poet Theodore Redke, who had been her professor at Bennington and also became her lover. And he followed her to Doubleday. He had actually originally been published by Knopf because he felt like she would sort of give him preferential treatment. And instead, the opposite happened. She sort of started telling him to, do his own work because she realized she was being manipulated by him, and asked to go above and beyond the call of duty for certainly for her pay grade, which was $35 a week at the time. And she ended up leaving for Paris with a cousin of hers as a chaperone. And a year and a half after she got there, Doubleday set up a Parisian outpost. And she was hired, in fact, as a secretary, though she had already been an editor at Doubleday. She was demoted there. And she was primarily working as social secretary for her boss, this guy, Francis K. Price, who mostly went out for half of every day. And he was gone so often that Judith set up her own literary agency in his absence, Judith Bailey and Associates, and began trying to sell work on her own using Doubleday's materials and phone lines and throwing parties on their dime. I mean, really just kind of working all the angles. And it was there that her boss, Frank Price, had already passed on the Diary of Anne Frank, which was already being published, had been published in German and Dutch and was coming out in French. And Judith read the galley in French, and went back against him and said, we've got to publish this book. And he came back after lunch one day and said, what, that book by that kid? And she said, yes, she understood it was a singular historical document. And also that the kind of unfettered voice of a young girl was a remarkably clear and unusual voice in literature. And so both culturally and historically, but also in terms of the authorial voice, it was a really rare and remarkable book, and she saw it right away. She didn't get to Knopf until 1957. It took her quite some time to get there, but when she did, it was on the rumor, in fact, that she was behind the publication of the Diary of Anne Frank and had gotten Doubleday to take it. Blanche Knopf, who is the co-founder of Alfred A. Knopf, starting in 1915. In fact, it was a term of her being willing to marry Alfred Knopf was that she be an equal partner in the publishing house. She would not marry him without it. But of course, her name was never on the company's, on the embossment, and she was not treated as an equal, though many people who know the history of Knopf know that she was really chief tastemaker, particularly in the early decades of that publishing house. She traveled all over the world, scouting talent for Knopf. She brought Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre to Knopf. She also brought Simone de Beauvoir, and Judith worked on the translations of Sartre and Camus. It's been misquoted in the HBO series that she was their editor. She never was, but she did work on the translations. But right from the jump at Knopf, she recognized that she was being treated as a secretary, and that in fact, even though she was editing under Blanche's name, really editing Langston Hughes, Elizabeth Bowen, she was given John Hersey and John Updike all within her first 3 years there, she was not being paid. In the same way that her male colleagues were being paid, she was not given her own office. She sat outside of Blanche's office, and she was really treated as a secretary. And the first time that she went and asked for a raise to Alfred Knopf, he didn't even deign to respond in person. He had his assistant write her a note saying, well, okay, we'll give you a little bump in salary, but could you please entertain your authors more? I mean, think of the kind of condescension and sexism behind that. He would never have said anything of the sort to his male authors. And that continued through her time there. So in 1966, Blanche Knopf died, and Judith was sort of freed in a way to take on more of her own projects. But it didn't mean that she was being treated any better by her male colleagues in terms of pay equality, in terms of reverence and respect at the house. And it wasn't until the mid-70s when Bob Gottlieb, the late Robert Gottlieb, who many people know about now because of his memoir he published, Avid Reader, several years ago, and also the documentary that came out last year before he died, where he is featured with Robert Caro, the author of The Power Broker, one of his best-known authors. He has now become something of a Maxwell Perkins figure, another famous editor, but Judith went to him at one point and asked for a raise after a female colleague of hers, who she'd actually shared an office with at Doubleday in 1948, realized what Judith was making and was appalled. She realized that Judith was being grossly underpaid. And when Judith approached Gottlieb, and I quote this interview that I did with Gottlieb at length in the book, and she asked him for a raise, he just squashed her and really told her that she was being paid in concert with what she was producing for the house, which was not true at all. That cookbooks, he sort of pushed them off to the side in terms of their importance. Well, other people who were at Knopf at the time went on record saying to me, when we got to Knopf in the late 60s and early 70s, cookbooks were the hottest thing going. Everyone knew it. Julia Child was a superstar at the time, and those books were selling like gangbusters. And then she started to do more of it with authors like Claudia Rhoda and Mater Jaffray. So, she never achieved full equality at Knopf. Her final boss, Sunny Mehta, who came in as editor-in-chief in 1986, did give her a significant raise. But when she died, and she had been there again for 57 years, when she retired in 2011, she was making $115,000. She had made tens upon tens of millions of dollars for the house. And it's certainly a healthy salary. I don't mean to diminish a six-figure salary, but given her longevity there and her tremendous impact on the house and on American letters at large, she was being grossly underpaid throughout the entirety of her career.
At the Greenbrier one year, again, talking to Julia Child, I said, what are you working on now? And she mentioned some book that she was working on. I said, are you doing that? Is Judith Jones going to be your editor for that? She said, no, as I recall, no, we changed publishers for that one book. She said, they weren't very nice to my representative, so we got a different publisher.
That's
And
true.
yeah.
At the very end, it's true. She was not published by Knopf at the very end of her life, but almost until the bitter end. And she did, in fact, come back. So she did her first book with Jacques Pepin with Knopf, and Judith was very involved in that book. And like a long marriage, Judith and Julia had chapters of their relationships. In a way, they really built each other's culinary careers. I think it's fair to say that neither woman would have gotten where she got without the other, and they knew that. And they were very transparent and forthcoming with one another, particularly when they were working on mastering the art of French cooking at the beginning, in sort of having these aha moments back and forth. What a wonder it was for author to have such an editor who is so careful, so interested, who is testing the recipes at home, but vice versa for editor to have an author who is such a workhorse and so diligently willing to revise the recipes, to strip the book back and really bring it to its fullest and best expression of self. That was a tremendous high for the two of them together. They really built each other's confidence. But it also was a political statement for the two of them together, because this was during the early rumblings of second wave feminism. And what Judith and Julia were doing was kind of another way of expressing an empowered femininity that was not of the Betty Friedan sort. It was not the leave the kitchen behind and your apron on the floor. It was saying, the kitchen can be a control center of the house and as a place of influence. No one should be sentenced to the kitchen. But if one chooses to be there and experience sensual pleasure, to use it as a place of exploration, of curiosity, of expressing artistry, then one should feel entitled to do so. And like any other facet of our culture, it should be valued and honored. And that was sort of their political ethics that they shared together, that, as Judith told me, was a source of rebellion for the two of them against this kind of leave it behind American ethos of the mid-century, which was really pushing women both out of the paid workforce, but also out of their homes simultaneously, and led a lot of women to question, well, then where do we belong? If we can have neither, what space is ours? Where is our realm of creativity? Where do we get to plant our flags? And Judith and Julia decided to do that in the kitchen. For Julia, it was her life's work, and for Judith, it was part of her life's work. But both of them took the work of cooking and writing about it very, very seriously. And because they treated cookbooks and recipe writing, but also the language of head notes, treated them with the kind of same literary rigor as one would a poem. That's part of why Judith's cookbooks are so remarkable, is because she trained that literary eye onto them as she would a work of fiction, verse, a work of history, reportage, etc.
Um, and of course, I keep reading that Judith edited all of Julia's books, and except most people don't know there was that one that she didn't edit, that I was just speaking about. And at the Greenbrier, I said to Judith, I said, you edited all of Julia's books except for one. She said, this is interesting. She said, yes. And I was very hurt.
She was.
And I don't think Julia had anything to do with her not editing that book. I don't.
She had a little bit to do with it.
Oh, okay.
She did. By that point, Julia had a kind of entourage around her, and she had a very powerful agent. She had powerful producers, but she was a global celebrity, and she wielded the kind of influence and the knowing that she could have gone to any publishing house in the country, and anyone would have been delighted to have Julia Childs on their list. But again, Judith had brought Julia up and vice versa. And so when Julia decided to make a jump for that one book based on finances, Judith was really hurt, in part because I think she really believed that their relationship transcended the dollar sign. But in a way, that was an old-fashioned value that Judith had, one that I really respected from her. But publishing is a business, and book advances are how some people make their living. Certainly someone as powerful as Julia at that point understood she could command huge advances. And Judith wanted the integrity of the relationship to be enough to keep them together. But there was a way in which Julia came into a different understanding of the economics of her work than Judith ever did. And I think it was a rift between them that never fully healed. And it reflected a different set of values as the late 20th century came along.
But Julia did come back to her.
She did come back for the end of her career. She did, yep.
Yeah. Can you talk about her? Well, I'll just mention when I actually did an article about Julia Child as she was approaching her 92nd birthday, and what she was doing as she approached her 92nd birthday. In the article, it appeared in the Tribune, and it appeared on a Wednesday, and Julia died on a Friday. So I guess I finished off Julia Child that way. But Judith, one of the people I interviewed for that article was Judith, and Julia. When I called up originally to say I want to do this story, I didn't want to talk to Julia. I was talking to her assistant, and Julia was in the background saying, "Tell him to call so and so and so." So of course Judith was one that I called, but Judith spoke about working with her, how they'd be cooking in her kitchen, drinking wine at night. And Judith would go to bed exhausted late at night. And she said she would hear thumping. This is at Julia's home, thumping, bumping in the morning. And she said they were on, Julia and Paul were on their exercise machines. And
At
she
6
said,
a.m. every day.
at 6 a.m., she said, and there I was almost ready to die. She said they had so much energy, and she said I could hardly keep up with them.
It
But
was
that was
consistent from the jump, from the very first time that Julia Child and Simone Beck went on book tour with Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Judith sort of was like, I cannot possibly keep up, but they were tireless. I mean, Julia in particular. You know, I think some of that is just personality. Judith was certainly could be a wonderful people person, but she was quite private. I think there was a kind of introverted nature to her in a way. She really needed time alone, in part to do the work of editing manuscripts. You need to be able to sort of close out the noise around you and get to that quiet place. And Julia was an absolute extrovert. I mean, she loved the limelight. So some of it was they got their energy from different places. But I think they sort of they egged each other on in a way, because they were two of the hardest working women in the business, and they knew it. So they were constantly trying to keep up with one another, and you know, they motivated one another in a really tremendous and meaningful way. I think what a gift both to the other to have someone as hardworking, as motivated, as tireless as you are, making the book its best. You know, at every turn, that kind of commitment is so rare in publishing. I hear it again and again, and it's certainly been my experience. You know, you're lucky if you get a full round of notes from an editor these days. I mean, a really thorough read on a manuscript. These women went back and forth via transatlantic mail for a year and a half for that book before Judith would let it go to press. I mean, just the level of commitment to excellence was tremendous between the two of them.
And Judith was more than an editor in the sense. It sounds like from your writing, she was a recipe tester
She
too.
was a recipe tester for all of her cookbooks. She tested at least some of the recipes, and in part it was because she wanted to make sure the recipes worked. She, you know, what could be worse than publishing a cookbook where the recipes were flawed? And she understood that in order for her career in cookbooks to continue, especially in the early days of that work, you know, the books had to be perfect, or she would not be granted permission from Knopf to keep doing them. They had to be flawless. And she understood, again, that there was a very critical watch upon her, and that if her books were not excellent, really, really unmatched, that Knopf would just pull the plug on the cookbook line. So part of it was that motivated her. But also she wanted that intimate connection with her authors in the same way that any writer she worked with. She wanted to hone the particularity of their voice. She understood that cooking is a kind of voice. And so she wanted to understand her cookbook authors' voices, which was how they cooked in the kitchen. She also understood that we often struggle to write down our own recipes accurately, and that it's very helpful to have someone cooking from the same recipe you've written down and pointing out where you may have omitted a detail, or where another sort of sensory cue could be useful, particularly when you were introducing cuisines and dishes that many American cooks had never seen or tasted before, right? So without photography, and certainly before the advent of cable television, the idea that someone could learn to cook a dish who may not be a talented or experienced home cook, but who also had no familiarity with particular ingredients or techniques, that they could cook a recipe successfully, meant that those recipes had to be incredibly detailed, and all of the cues, whether that was the scent of something, the color that something would turn when it reached its sort of tipping point, that all of that needed to be included for the recipe to be excellent. And part of the way that those details got included was for Judith to ask the authors to include them after she'd tried the recipes herself, or she would be in the kitchen as her authors cooked, and she'd be taking notes and peppering them with questions. So I just did an event with Lydia Bastianich last week, and she was remembering, they worked together towards the end of Judith's career. Lydia was a restaurant chef and was constantly forgetting to write things down. You know, that you cook on instinct at some point, especially when you've been replicating a dish over and over and over again for years. And Judith would constantly say, now, hold on, what did you do? How much of that did you put it? And, you know, so there, this constant questioning of the assumptions of a cook's own recipes is, again, part of what makes the recipes in Judith's cookbooks so remarkable and makes her books so evergreen, so classic, is because they work.
I was vacationing in Wisconsin about 15 years ago, and I was staying at this farmhouse, and I wanted to make beef stew for dinner. They had some cookbooks there, and one of the books they had was from one of Julia's TV shows, but she had a classic recipe in there for beef uh, beef bourguignon or beef a la mode, it was called, but I think it was beef bourguignon. And so I thought, well, this will be beef stew, and I made it. And honestly, I knew Julia Child, I had all her books. I'd never really cooked from it before. I was blown away. And I think would have been one Judith Jones had edited. I was blown away by how I could cook. If I followed everything, it came out wonderful. There was one thing I didn't follow, and Julia had said, if you don't follow this, it's going to be too salty. Was. And I thought, oh my God, this is brilliance to be able to have a printed page and somebody follows it, and they're a gourmet cook. If they've never cooked before, it would come out just right. And somebody told me that maybe Dory Greenspan said nobody wrote a recipe like Julia Child. And now that I'm talking to you, I'm wondering how much of that clarity, that brilliance in the recipe writing was Judith's hand too.
It's a really good question. Certainly with mastering the art of French cooking, it's important to remember that Julia Child was one of a writing team of three. So Simca Beck and, Simone Beck, who went by Simca, and Louisette Bertol, were more experienced cooks than Julia was when they found her. And they did. There's a wonderful story that's outlined in great detail in Bob Spitz's Deary, which is a really long biography of Julia Child. Forget the HBO Max show and go read Deary. It's really remarkable. But they picked Julia Child out of the crowd in Paris because they had been trying to write a cookbook of French recipes for an American audience. And they had been told by someone in publishing, what you need is to find an American who can help you translate, right? What you women understand is the ins and outs of French cooking, but you need someone who can help you translate that for an American audience, which is quite different. Certainly in the late 1950s at the time, it wasn't even the late 50s. It was the early 1950s when they started working together. Was a very different cooking audience than the American audience. Most French cooks were still cooking from scratch day in and day out. They were going to the markets every day. By the early 1950s in the United States, particularly among the middle and upper classes of white folks, that was not the case anymore. Many people were either farming out the work of cooking to someone they had hired, or they were relying increasingly on ready-made foods, on boxed foods, on canned foods, on frozen foods, on mixes and things of that nature. That was de rigueur at the time. So Julia Child was that bridge because she too had not been able to learn how to cook when she was living in the United States. She learned as an adult in Paris when she went to the Cordon Bleu. So the excellence of the dishes, particularly in the first mastering, is a product of three very, very, very skilled cooks. And I think that sometimes gets written out of the narrative inappropriately. What Julia Child was a tremendous correspondent with Judith. And it was they together who edited those recipes, who revised those recipes. So linguistically, we owe a huge amount to Judith and Julia as a duo, that they pushed each other to clarity, right? And also, again, that Judith was testing those recipes in the United States when Julia Child was still living abroad, first in France and then later in Norway, before she eventually came home. She had just moved home to the United States when Mastering the Art of French Cooking was published in the fall of 1961. She had not tested a single one of those recipes on United States soil. It was Judith who did that, who went to the supermarkets and made sure that, say, a certain cut of meat was available, or that certain type of mushrooms was available. And if it wasn't, Judith would go back to Julia and say, we have to write this differently. An American home cook won't be able to make this recipe. So part of what I'm getting at here that I think is very little understood outside the world of recipe writing and cookbooks specifically is that the work that goes into writing cookbooks and into testing recipes is tremendous. And to a general audience, that is quite invisible. One senses that a cook scribbles down some notes. You know, they've cooked this dish so many times, they know it in their bones, they write it down, the end. But that is not at all the case. And part of the reason that Judith needed to do so much of the recipe testing after Mastering the Art of French Cooking's success was that Knopf didn't give her a budget to hire recipe testers. You know, the advances for cookbooks, not until the very end was she giving any more than a $7,500 advance to her best cookbook authors. So these books were being made on a shoestring budget.
And I have had to interview chefs, and they would give me their recipes. And these brilliant chefs, and I would say, just looking at it, I said, this won't work. This is awful. And then I had to translate it and adjust it. And I've had a lot of cooking classes. I'm not a chef. And so it was very difficult. And it hit me again, the almost brilliance it takes to write a clear, simple recipe that one can follow. And yeah, again, and there's an incident that you mentioned too, where Judith, they were going to do Mastering the Art Volume 2, right? And Judith said you have to have bread recipe in there, have bread recipes, and Julia resisted, and Judith was insistent, and that I guess Judith went out and tested a bunch of recipes herself.
Well, the whole team was working on the bread story is really wonderful. Julia Child said, French people don't bake their bread, they buy their bread. Every neighborhood has its own bakery. Why would we include a recipe for that? And Judith again said, but okay, we're not in Paris here, we're not in France, we're in the United States of America. That's our audience. And store-bought bread at the time, it was pretty abysmal. This was sort of the height of Wonder Bread, of the sliced white enriched bread. And so yes, Julia and Paul Child together would test recipes in Cambridge, and they would do all sorts of things to try to get it right. They would introduce steam baths into the bottom of an oven. They would use various kinds of tiles and bricks to get the oven hotter than a conventional home oven wanted to go. And then Judith would, the sort of promising recipes, when they sent her one and said, we're getting pretty close, Judith would test herself with her husband, who also was a remarkable and very devoted home cook. And they had a tremendous amount of fun doing about it, so much that their first book together, Judith and her husband, who wrote under the name Evan Jones, but who was known as Dick for most of his life, ended up doing their first cookbook together on bread. They did 2 bread books together. It was a great passion of theirs. And Judith also edited James Beard's book of bread. So she really sort of caught bread fever, and ended up baking most of her own bread for the rest of her life. I mean, she really decided, why would you buy it when you can make it delicious at home and do all kinds of styles of bread from all over the world?
And Judith also wrote her own cookbook at the end, right? The Pleasure of Cooking for One.
Yes.
And I have that book, and that's really a unique concept. And
it's a wonderful book. It's a
yes,
wonderful book. She
yes.
was 85 when she published that book, and I write about this again in my book, in The Editor. But I think one of the kind of subversive threads throughout Judith's life was that she really understood that a culture that is not comfortable with pleasure, with sensuality, is a culture that is uncomfortable with freedom and with liberation. And she was determined to be a free and liberated person. The fact that she was a woman was part of that for her, but she didn't feel that should be unique to women, and she never felt an affiliation with the feminist movement. But she did believe in freedom and in pleasure. So to come out at 85 with a book that foregrounds pleasure as a birthright, as something that one should entitle oneself to, is such a remarkable thing. And then it's just a delightful book. I mean, she's sort of reminding you all the time, well, no one's looking. If you make a mistake, just, revise, riff, riff, riff. This is just for you. And that as long as you in the end are pleased, as long as the meal is delicious and you're having fun making it, who cares? How often do we see women in their 80s articulating an ethics of pleasure publicly? I mean, it's really kind of a politically remarkable and radical thing to do.
And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to read the chat questions. But again, how honored I was how lucky I was to have gotten to meet this remarkable, elegant, approachable, there are no words, Renaissance woman of an editor. Does that make sense, what I just said? Renaissance woman of an editor. That's a jumble of words, but you know what I'm saying. It's clear as mud, but it covers the ground. But anyway, Kathy, could you handle the chat questions, please?
With happiness. There's an anecdote from Gail Gann, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. But I just want to start with some of the questions. To what extent was Judith's treatment salary-wise at Knopf? Was it simply representative of how all or many women were treated in business at that time?
It's a good question. I think it depends on the moment in Judith's career. Again, remember, she was at Knopf for 57 years, but she started in publishing quite a bit earlier than that. So 15 years earlier than that. You know, I've been asked this question before, and I really resist it because I think it suggests that pay equity is something that we should always sort of brush aside and just say, oh, it was the times. And to some extent, that is true. There were not laws on the books about pay equity at the time, but there were women, namely Blanche Knopf, at Knopf, who understood the kind of value that Judith had to the house and who were making more money and could have advocated for her if they so chose. You know, there were other people at Knopf who were given financial promotions, even if their title didn't change, based on sort of what we might call a bonus structure in other realms of business. Judith never was. So the only raise that she was given without asking in the entirety of her time at Knopf was after Sonny Mehta arrived in 1986, and he believed she was being terribly underpaid. He believed that she had an incomparable list in publishing, not just at Knopf, but in publishing. And he had come from London, and he knew how valuable her authors were to the whole world of 20th century literature. But, you know, I hope that many, if not all of you, will read the book and read what Bob Gottlieb says, because I think it's tremendously reflective of what was going on at the time. You know, he makes a point when I was speaking to him where he says, well, I never had to ask for a raise. Money was just thrust at me. And it's so suggestive of the ways that certain people in power, namely white men, felt entitled to ask for and demand raises or leave and felt like they could be hired somewhere else. Women did not have the same kind of privilege. And though Judith had a great deal of confidence in her relationships with her authors, she did not have a whole lot of confidence in the publishing industry at large. And I don't think she had the same confidence that she could jump from Knopf and be scooped up and valued somewhere else. Also, having the Knopf name behind her, she understood was very valuable. Because they were considered and still are one of the best publishers in the English language, she knew that if she did want to go after an author, it was very valuable to her as an editor to have the Knopf name behind her. And she knew that it mattered to her authors and her potential authors as well. And so she didn't have that kind of freedom where she could say the hell with you and just move on. That wasn't necessarily available to her.
There was a question, who edited the Baking with Julia?
That was a Judith
Was
book.
what was the book that wasn't a Judith book?
I'm blanking on it at the moment. Remember, I'm keeping in my mind.
Oh, okay, that's okay.
100
I have that.
authors,
I have that
Julia
problem.
only being one of them. So
Okay, well, here's a question. The TV show gave the impression, maybe it's Baking with Julia or maybe another one, but gave the impression that Judith Jones was not interested in being known as a cookbook editor. Oh, maybe it's one of those dramas. This conversation leads me to think she began to embrace that identity at some point. Can you talk about that?
sure. So the episode that
Or
someone is asking, the episode someone is asking about here is in the first season of the HBO Max series Julia, and it is a completely fictionalized scene in which Julia Child is in San Francisco. There's a lot that is wrong with that series, and there's some really egregious factual errors. But in that episode, part of what happens is that Julia Child is with James Beard and then introduces James Beard to Judith. That's all backwards. It was Judith who cold called James Beard to help promote Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and then introduced Julia and James Beard to one another, and they did become fast friends. Judith resisted the idea that she was only the cookbook editor, and she really considered that a slight to the end of her career. But she did not consider it a dirty word in the way that the show suggests she did. That scene makes it look like cookbooks were just something she was doing off to the side, that she herself didn't take very seriously, that it was sort of all happenstance that she had begun working on Mastering the Art of French Cooking. She worked very hard to get Knopf to acquire that book. And then she worked very hard on making it excellent before it was published. So no, I would say trust almost nothing in that series. I'm making myself watch the second season because I feel like it's important for me to, but they get Judith and many other people entirely wrong, and I think a pretty unforgivable way, because there is lots of archival evidence that they could have gone to support a much more truthful narrative.
That's what happens when it goes to Hollywood, right? If someone else other than Sara wrote a Judith Jones biography, would that author devote an entire chapter to Edna Lewis?
Maybe, maybe not.
I guess you don't, I don't know. You know, you have to make choices all the time.
You do. I'm
Okay.
very, very clear in the introduction to this book that why I made some of the choices I did, and that I was following both Judith's interests as she explained them to me in our conversations together about authors and books that really transformed her worldview and her editorial sensibility. But also, as all biographers do, I was filtering through my own curiosities. Most biographers don't name that because they hide behind this sort of notion of objectivity, but it's always false. Biographers are always making choices about what they do and don't include. And when they don't make those choices, what results is a completely unreadable 1,000+ page book that no one actually gets through, that is really just a compendium of facts and not a narrative.
It is often why, if we do tours, I try to get the curator, because the curator knows the hard decisions and the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor,
Right.
and they regret it, but there was no more space. Drooling over the access Sara was given to the phenomenal records, where are Judith's private pages, especially her journals, stored now? I hope they are being placed in an archive. Maybe it's Hollis at Schlesinger, where Julia's are?
They are still with Judith's stepdaughter in Vermont. I have been told again and again that they have been promised to the Schlesinger, but they are not there yet, and I don't know when they will get there.
That's interesting. Okay, so, all right, because we were having a discussion, I thought you said they had gone to the Schlesinger, so
No, our
sorry.
oral histories are there, and they are available for the public.
Okay. Do you have a sense of any regrets Judith had professionally, or anything she wished she could have done, but the time or market wasn't right?
Yes, absolutely. Again, I would urge you very, very much, of course, to buy and read the book. But many misses, and some, I think Judith regretted personally because she felt like she hadn't been given the license to move on a book that she wanted to. An example of that would be Sylvia Plath's Ariel, which is detailed in my book, but is detailed even more in Emily Van Duyn's book that's coming out in July called Loving Sylvia Plath, which is a really incredible book. But it was really Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath's widow, who just made that impossible. He was really difficult to work with. He did not like Judith. He condescended towards her tremendously, and he ended up going with a different publisher and with a male editor for that book. So that's one that Judith really fought hard to acquire, but wasn't able to. She rejected twice the short stories of Alice Munro, the late, great Alice Munro, who we just lost a few weeks ago. Though I never got the sense that Judith regretted that. She understood that it was a miss in terms of who Alice Munro became in the world of letters, but it wasn't, she wasn't an author that Judith wanted to work with, that she felt connected to. In the cookbook realm, the one book that I know she really wished she could have published, and I tell this story in detail in the book, is Honey from a Weed by Patience Gray, which has continued to sell throughout the years. But when Judith saw the manuscript in 1986 and it had been sent to her from a literary agent in London, publishing had really begun to change, and both publishers and bookstores were beginning to consolidate and become more corporate. And Judith understood that she couldn't go out on a limb for the kind of niche titles that she had really cut her teeth on, in cookbooks in particular. And so she said no to that. She wrote this very kind of heartbreaking letter to this guy, Alan Davidson, saying, I wish I could, but I'm not able to at this point in the life of Knopf. Not in my life as an editor, but in the life of Knopf, right? Because an editor is always beholden multiply to her authors in an individual way, but also to the book business. And those relationships are often in conflict.
Wow. I'm halfway through the book. Kudos, loving it. Hate to ask this, but did Judith ever suggest there was a connection between Knopf turning down the bell jar and Plath's suicide?
No, Judith didn't talk to me about Sylvia Plath at all. I suggest that it's possible where I position the rejection of the bell jar, but Judith never said anything of the sort.
By the way, I did read, or I didn't read the book, the last book, the cookbook, Cooking for One, but I read some of the articles related to it. And the one that still sticks in my mind, and I think about it when I'm at the grocery store, is how she would ask, okay, like what, there's 3 pork chops or lamb chops, I only need 1. And going back and asking them to repackage for 1. I still have not pulled the trigger on doing that. Because I've kind of discussed it like at Costco, where they put a large volume of stuff, in a package. Well, that's why you get a good price. It's like, yeah, but I don't need 7 fish. I need 3. But I always think about that. Wilbur Jones says, hi all. In 1995, I submitted my first cookbook manuscript to Knopf. Judith turned it down. However, it was one of the best rejection letters ever. She gave me a list of suggestions to get it published with another publisher. She told me that my book would do well in the marketplace, but it was too trendy for Knopf. In 1996, my first book, this new soul food cookbook, Cut the Fat to Keep the Flavor, that book sold 52,000, including a mass print by Avon as a special point to promote a healthy eating and exercise campaign. I know. Gail Gand, she wrote for baking for Julia, Baking with Julia. She says, we had to send our recipes to Dory, but I never thought about who edited. Dory was the writer, right? Because I mentioned Dory. In fact, Dory even has a title on that book. Now, you mentioned leftovers early on in your conversation. And this woman, she loves leftovers. Can you share an anecdote or favorite way that Judith reinvented leftovers?
Oh, I don't want to speak for Judith's favorite way, and she outlines many favorite ways in The Pleasures of Cooking for One. It is a really wonderful, it's a lovely read, but it's also a very useful cookbook. So I'd recommend, if you don't have a copy already, that maybe you purchase one or take it out of your public library. But she would do things like, because supermarkets and even many butchers pre-package their meat, or if she was getting a whole chicken or something of that nature, she'd cook the whole thing. She'd usually roast her meats, and then she'd have it that night for supper, and then she'd put it in the fridge, and then she'd leave it alone for a day, and then she'd pull it back out. So the very first lunch that I ever had with her, she served slices of cold leftover roast beef on day-old baguette that she had sliced and toasted back into its life. And she made sauce gribiche, which is a condiment made out of hard-boiled eggs, parsley, capers, and cornichon that she had learned to love in Paris. So she wasn't someone who just pulled the cold leftovers out of the fridge and sat and ate them on her lap in front of the television. She never ate dinner like that. But she wanted to breathe new life into them. So she, in the same way that she was deeply creative with her manuscript, she was very creative with leftovers. She wanted to be excited and interested in what she was eating, and that meant breathing new life into something.
Okay, I will ask. I don't know what to say, but sorry to be obsessed with Edna Lewis, but I do live in Farrington Village part of the year, where Edna was guest chef 41 years ago, and where her chocolate souffle is grandfathered on the menu. Sara, in your access to all those materials, how many yellow legal tablet pages written with Edna's chicken scratch did you discover? Can't wait to hear.
So many. Those papers belong to Knopf's private collection, which is in a storage facility in Connecticut. They pulled the boxes for me so that I could look at them in the office and take photographs of them. Countless. I mean, so many, but I've also become very close with some of Enna Lewis's relatives through the editing of my book on Enna Lewis. The anthology that I edited about her, and have seen many more yellow legal pages through them. So many, Marcy.
You had a very fortunate situation there. with all those people giving you access, because sometimes that just doesn't happen. Are we finished? Oh, no, looks like there's one more question. Hold on. Can you repeat the name of the French sauce? Cornichons is one of the ingredients that Judith made for the cold roast beef.
Yeah, gribiche. So I'm terrible at spelling aloud, but Gribiche. So gribiche. And I believe she includes a recipe for it in The Pleasures of Cooking for One, actually.
Cool. Sarah, what's your favorite darling, this best story or anecdote you had to leave out of the book?
Oh my goodness. That's a great question. I love that question. I mean, there's so many love letters between Judith and the poet Theodore Roethke that I quote some of them, but my God, it's an entire book. So many sort of tortured love letters. He was manic depressive, and Judith was terribly in love with him, even though he was not very good or consistent to or with her. But in the cookbook department, I would say there was an entire chapter that I wrote that got cut about Judith really being just up in arms about the era of anthologized cookbooks that began really in the 1970s, particularly the Time Life cookbooks, because the series was not paying royalties to the authors of the original recipes, nor to the original publishers of the books that those recipes came from. So I reference it briefly in the book, but there was an entire chapter of sort of Judith just saying, you know, you can't do this. These people have poured their labor, their time into writing up these recipes and making them their own. You know, you can't have ownership over a dish, but you can have ownership over a recipe, which is about language and detail. And she was just, you know, as publishing began to change, as she felt like it was speeding up, as it was taking shortcuts, she became really disillusioned with it as she went. And again, I think part of the reason she stayed at Knopf as long as she did is because Knopf as a publishing house allowed her to do things a rather old-fashioned way until the end of her career. As I forget the question asker's name or the anecdote sharer's name, but the fellow who was rejected by Judith Jones, she rejected all kinds of trendy cookbooks because they weren't what Knopf did, and they weren't what she did at Knopf. But she understood that there were plenty of other publishers who were, you know, chomping at the bit for those kinds of books. But she wanted to do things slowly, differently, in such a way that the books would be evergreen, and that as trends change, those books would still be valuable and they would continue to sell.
Interesting. Now, do you think like that one chapter talking about those anthologies might end up like as an article somewhere?
Probably not. I think I have been writing and thinking about Judith for 11 years now, and I think I'm probably going to take a big break after finally getting this book out, I have to say.
By the way, in those anthologies, did it also include the Better Home and Gardens and Cooking Encyclopedia?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't remember seeing it mentioned in Judith's letters, but that doesn't mean that some of her authors' recipes were not used in those. But she really went after Time Life. Also, they poached some of her authors to edit those anthologies, and she just could, you know, she did not want to participate in the kind of cattiness of the food world as it grew up. She really believed in loyalty, as I referenced earlier, that kind of slight that she felt when Julia Child went with another publisher for one book because they offered her more money. She wanted to work in a world in which integrity and personal relationship and values trumped money. And the world did not necessarily agree with her, nor did all of her authors. I mean, there were people who submitted manuscripts to Judith who she might have wanted to work with, who took their books elsewhere because other publishing houses would offer them higher advances than Knopf would. So that was something she was up against.
Competition. But the reason I mentioned about Better Homes and Garden, it was one of those books that if you went to the grocery store, you could buy a different section each week. And my mother bought up to 5, and there was actually 12, but via garage sales or whatever, I completed the set. But I used it for a number of years because it had some very good authors and articles in there. But it was like a little encyclopedia. I loved it. I think maybe if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Gail Gand to unmute herself and tell the story she told us about her one interaction with Judith Jones.
Oh, Kathy, could you just briefly tell everyone, if they don't already know, who Gail Gand is?
Gail Gand maybe you could talk about yourself.
Can
How's
you
that?
hear, can
I
you
know
hear,
you're not shy.
ah, can you hear me? I'm not sure if my
Absolutely.
microphone's on. Oh, you're making me blush, Scott.
Well, you know
Um,
what? Can I say a few things about you so you don't blush too much? But
oh, okay, that's
It's
fine.
I,
worse.
Gail Gand is one of the nation's top pastry chefs, right? You've gotten the James Beard Award for your pastry. You've written all kinds of books, and she's our trophy member. But anyway, Gail is quite famous and well known, and well, famous and well known, and award winning. So we'd be honored for you to ask a question, Gail.
That's very sweet of you,
Oh, you
Scott.
have
Thank you.
your own TV series. Anyway, you're a star. Go on.
That's so much. Sarah, I can send you my bio if that makes it easier.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a question actually, Scott. It was just a story, and I can't place the date. But I used to I live in Chicago, and I often went to New York City. And when I was much younger, there was a time where I flew into Kennedy Airport and I took the bus into Manhattan because I always stayed with my family in Midtown. And I sat next to this nice little sort of frail woman, and we got to talking about food. And somehow I identified my love affair I was having with cheese at the time. And she said, "Oh, my husband wrote a book about cheese." And I said, "Really? What's it called and what's his name?" And she said, "Oh, it's the world. I think it's called The World of Cheese. Um, and his name is Evan Jones." And I'm like, "Oh, I think I have that book." And she's, kind of just shyly said her name was Judith. And I don't think at the time I really understood. I mean, I knew the name Judith Jones, but I wasn't quite sure what I knew it from. And she mentioned she was a cookbook editor. So I was on a bus with her for like 45 minutes sitting next to her. I might have been 30 at the time. I'm almost 70 now. So this was, a long time ago. But I was sitting next to her, and later in life, I get to contribute to Julia Child's Baking with Julia book as one of the 27 voices from across the country that write that book. So it's curious that I guess inadvertently I got to work with Judith much later in my career, but got to meet her very early on. It was quite a thrill.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks for all your stories. And boy, your brain is like a safe, just keeping all that information and detail. And I hope you never stop talking about it. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're not the only James Beard Award winner on the list tonight. We got Michael Gebert, who got it in writing some years ago. Tonight's the James Beard Awards here in Chicago. So there's people here that I would have thought would have been there, but they're with us tonight, which I'm thrilled about.
But it's
Anyway, Scott,
it's very expensive to go to the James Beard.
I know, I have never bothered. Somebody said, "I truly appreciate the exposure to your diligent work, much more than academic scholarship, and also a deep personal connection, which is so uncommon." Anyway,
Thanks.
Scott, I'm turning it over to you to say adieu.
Well, on a final note, on a sweet note, a final sweet note about Judith Jones, she had a number of stepchildren. Is that right?
She had two stepdaughters, and then she and her husband adopted two children.
And she was not a wicked stepmother, right? She loved her stepchildren, right?
I think that I'm going to say go ahead and read the book. It's a complicated question.
Oh, okay, because I did read some things, but that
No,
sounds
she was
like,
certainly not wicked, but it was complicated. It was
oh,
complicated.
okay. I guess I looked at the uncomplicated quotes about it. So, but never mind. Anyway, thank you so much. This was a buffet of savory information, and it was luscious. Thank you so much for sharing about this amazing figure in the cooking world and the literary world.
Thank
And
you for having me, and I hope many of you will go out and buy the book and learn so much more.
yeah, the book is, do you have a copy? You do have a copy. Can you hold it up? And the title of this wonderful book is The Editor, How Publishing Legend Judith Jones Shaped Culture in America by
Look,
Sara.
and here she is looking so minxy on the back. Mischievous Judith. Serious Judith on the front, mischievous Judith on the back.
Wonderful. And I don't think it's going to win any awards in the cookbook category, but literary award, I hope so. Thank you so much, and good luck with everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight.
Good night.